Welcome to all to this webinar on Western truth, Chinese truth, the transatlantic alliance and the challenge of China. I'm Jean-Guillaume de Tocqueville and I would like to warmly welcome you. As you know, the initial plan was to be in Normandy this weekend, enjoying the countryside and peaceful Tocqueville, but coronavirus otherwise decided. So we certainly shall meet again in Tocqueville next year and reshape the world together. In the meantime, we have the pleasure to e-meet this year on a smaller format and keep contributing to the public debate. And a warm thank you to the team of the Atlantic Council, which has put together this webinar. 2020 has been so far a very challenging year at world level, with the health crisis, with the political and economic crisis, and even with the civilization crisis, as shown the upheaval against racism. Today, we shall concentrate on a key issue, the challenges that China and its rulers impose on the rest of the world, and the responses which must be provided by the US, by the EU, and if possible, in a coordinated way. So it's my pleasure to welcome you all, to welcome our panelists, and I would like to thank them warmly in the name of all of us. And I give the floor to Benjamin.
Thank you, Jean-Guillaume. Hi, good morning for those watching in the United States. Good afternoon in Europe. I'm Ben Haddad. I'm the director of the Future Europe Initiative at the Atlantic Council in Washington. I'm delighted to introduce this conversation in partnership with Fondation Tocqueville, Le Figaro, on the transatlantic relationship and the challenge of China. The Atlantic Council, you know it, is a bipartisan policy organization with a clear mission, promoting U.S. engagement with friends and allies across the world. The simple idea that we are stronger together as a transatlantic community. Today, the United States and Europe are facing an unprecedented health crisis with COVID-19, an economic crisis, and now protests across the country to fight racial injustice. In moments like this, it's tempting to lose sight of international challenges, of allies, and turn inward. This is why the Atlantic Council, in the last few months, we've gone on offense, keeping our friends and allies close to shape the world post-COVID together. We build multilateral organizations, tackle the challenges of new technologies, rethink global trade, and face the unprecedented security risks that this new world opens. The challenge coming from a more assertive China encompasses all of these questions. This is why this partnership with Le Figaro and Tocqueville is so critical to us. This is why we're grateful to be hosting this conversation today, and I'd like to thank Jean-Guillaume de Tocqueville, as well as our non-resident senior fellow, Laure Mandeville from Le Figaro, and our board member, Anna Palacio, for making this conversation happen. And here's to hoping that we will continue this next year with all of you, our friends in Normandy. Thank you very much, and let me turn to Laure.
Okay, I'm not Robin Williams, but I will say it. Good morning, America, and good afternoon, Europe, since we are on both sides of the Atlantic here. So my name is Laure Mandeville. I'm a senior reporter with Le Figaro and the co-chair of the Tocqueville Conversations. It is a great pleasure to welcome you at this Tocqueville conversation, which of course, as Jean-Guillaume mentioned, lacks the bone and flesh and charm of the Tocqueville Chateau, the birthplace of Alexis Tocqueville, the great philosopher, who is an inspiration for our conversation. But still, we managed to organize a joint force and organize this timely conversation devoted to the Chinese challenge and how do we, the West, face it. The Asian century, as it has been called, recently has been emerging for quite a while. But since 1989, we naively decided that the strength of the market would liberalize the empire of the middle, and that the great era of globalization would be a win-win game. In fact, globalization transformed China into a giant, economical, technological, political, but it didn't transform it into a democracy. And in the meantime, globalization, as it appears, weakened us in many ways, industrially, politically, and stripped us of strategic ingredients of our sovereignty, like medicine, key technological components, and the Western emperor looks naked. That's why we have to discuss, both China today. We have to have this dive with our speakers into what is China, into the ambitions of China and the plans of China, but it's as well must be a dive into our own civilization and crisis, because we are, in fact, in sort of a Western civilization and crisis. There has to be a soul searching. There has to be some kind of diagnosis into what is wrong in the West and how we must sort of stand up and face up, our adversaries and the whole crisis today. As David Goldman, who is going to speak today, told me a few weeks ago, the West must get its act together. So now I'm going to give the floor to Anna, and for those of who don't know Anna, I know that many of you know her. Anna has been a former foreign minister of foreign affairs of Spain, and she was also vice president of the World Bank, and she's been more generally a driving force, both in the debate in Europe and the transatlantic debate, and she knows in and out, both sides of the Atlantic. And that's why she's going to be a very precious moderator today for this conversation. And I thank you very much for having, accompanied the Tocqueville conversations from the start in this sort of a very big intellectual adventure. Thank you very much. I give you the floor.
Thank you. It's me. It's a real privilege. I'm the moderator, and I'm going to introduce the panelists first. Just one word. I think that the exceptionality of our panelists is that if there is a scarce commodity today, is ideas. And our three panelists are just go against the tide. When we see normally rehash, repackage, just old ideas trying to put together something new, follow Andrew Michta, follow David Goldman, follow Pavel Fischer, and you will find real, new, fresh ideas that come from the oven. Just as a way of introduction, you all probably know the three speakers. On Andrew Michta, I will start by saying that he has insisted that I explain that he's speaking on his personal capacity. His views do not necessarily reflect those of the George C. Marshall European Center for Security Studies, the Department of Defense, or the United States government. He is Dean of the College of International Security Studies at the George C. Marshall European Center. David Goldman, investor, essayist, the author of a book that we are looking forward to have the opportunity to buy and read. If I understand well, the title of the book is enticing. You will be assimilated, China's plan to Sinoform the world. And last but not least, a view from Europe. And Pavel Fischer, President of the Commission for Foreign Affairs of the Senate of the Czech Republic. As I said, without further ado, let's us go. Andrew, you have written extensively that the crises that our societies are currently confronting have put up a mirror to our face as communities, as nations, as alliances, revealing not that pleasant truths. Where does China fit in this panorama?
Thank you, Anna. And again, thank you for having me to speak to such a terrific group. And as Anna already mentioned, I'm speaking in my private capacity here as an analyst. As Laure so eloquently stated, the problem set we have before us, I would argue, is to a large extent of our own making. We are at the tail end of 3 decades since the end of the Cold War. where our assumptions about globalization, export-driven modernization, China becoming a responsible stakeholder in the international system, the inevitable triumph of liberal democratic order globally, I think in hindsight will be seen as one of the greatest strategic miscalculations of the 20th century. We came out of the Cold War assuming that somehow great power competition has ended and that the normative system that history was ending, the normative system we're putting in place, and especially when it comes to economic cooperation, free markets, free trade, would dominate. I have argued for the last 2 decades, sometimes more or less unsuccessfully, I have to say, that this is an essential miscalculation. China is the largest geostrategic and global problem set, in my view, definitely since the end of the Cold War, and arguably one of the greatest that the West has confronted since it began to dominate the international system. It's a challenge facing the United States as a great power. It's a challenge facing our European allies. And it's a challenge facing also our democratic allies in Asia. And we're at an inflection point when it comes to our security. As I like to say, if you're in a hole, stop digging. We need a radical rethinking of our policies on China at a number of levels. The first being the kind of unfettered access that we have given the Chinese to every layer of our societies, to every layer of our scientific community, to every layer of our businesses, our finance. We are now faced with a situation where we have a geostrategically assertive China that is now present, not just economically, but also increasingly militarily, not just in the Indo-Pacific and in MENA and in Eurasia, but also in Europe. I would posit that China now is a power in Europe and at a multidimensional sense. What makes the situation even more complicated is the fact that China is aligned with Russia in its opposition to the US-led international democratic international liberal order. Russia approaches this as a revisionist power. It wants to revise the post-Cold War settlement. China wants to replace that settlement, I would argue. It wants to bring its own centered Eurasian order, if you will. And in the process, we are looking at a potential reversal of some of the critical strategic maritime to land domain relationships that we have seen over the last half of a millennium, I would argue. This is happening at the time when the Western societies are disunited, where there's a lot of friction and static between our European allies and the United States, where there's also a lot of disconnectivity developing in the Indo-Pacific. At the same time, the United States is approaching this national security dilemma after 2 decades of low-intensity warfare, which has restructured our military as well. Our military, I would argue, is too small to the task to confront 2 near-peer competitors in 2 potentially major theaters. To make matters worse, since we need to look at the relative power distribution as well, over the last 2 decades, we have seen substantial disarmament among our European allies, which makes the ability to actually deter the pressures that the Russian-Chinese alignment is pushing in our direction that much more complicated. Finally, last point in my opening statement, the Wuhan virus crisis has scrambled most of our assumptions about long-term power transition cycles, about the relative power distribution in different regions, and I would argue it has compressed the timeline on which these critical issues will be decided. Thank you, Anna. This is from me for the opening, and I will turn it over back to you.
Well, thank you, Andrew. To our audience, one logistic announcement. We will have a time for questions. If you have questions, send them through the application that you have at the bottom of your screen. Questions and for those of you that don't follow Andrew in Twitter, it's worth. I tell you, it's worth following him on Twitter. Now let me turn to you, David. David, what does the world look like with a China that is a technological hegemon, that has captured and harnessed the wave of the fourth industrial revolution ahead of us? Is this too exaggerated a picture?
Thank you, by the way, very much for your kind introduction, and thanks to the Atlantic Council and the Figaro for the invitation. And I think we have the misfortune to live at one of the great turning points in history. China has been around for several thousand years. For most of that time, it's turned inward because its internal requirements have prevented it from devoting the resources to extension beyond the borders that had established in the 8th century under the Tang Dynasty. In the past 30 years, China has increased its gross domestic product 10 times over. It's brought 1.4 billion people from absolute poverty to a modest degree of prosperity, and it's become a technological superpower. What does China want? I believe China doesn't want to conquer the world. It wants to be the world. The Cold War model, which is so frequently cited in the press, I think is in some ways misleading. China's empire started with the Yellow Valley civilization, with water management, flood control, irrigation, and canal building, water transport. Infrastructure created the Chinese empire. The Qin dynasty in the 3rd century BC unified China with massive water management projects. During the past 2 centuries, China has seen itself sidelined and impoverished, and China views this as a temporary aberration relative to its natural place in the world as the center of human civilization, in fact, as human civilization. What we observe with the Belt and Road project stretching across the Eurasian landmass, as well as China's ambitions to project its technological capacity through the world, is an extension, in my view, of Chinese empire building with more continuity than discontinuity with Chinese history. So the creation of Huawei is the first global company out of China capable of harnessing the talents of tens of thousands of engineers, is a new phase in China's expansion. When we talk about an Atlantic alliance, unfortunately, we have a situation in which, as Andrew Mission just said, China is a European power. Most of Huawei's basic R&D is done now by European engineers. So China foresees 5G telecommunications, artificial intelligence, and the many industrial, commercial, transportation, healthcare, and other applications arising from this as the foundation for China to assimilate the rest of the world and, as I said, to sino-form the world, to use its economic model to assimilate first the Eurasian landmass, Africa, and of course, Southeast Asia. Our response to that, in my view, has been woefully inadequate. Defensive measures such as trying to deny access for China to American technology have at best a temporary use. With 1.4 billion people and now a highly skilled population and world-class universities, China cannot be suppressed. It can only be leapfrogged. And the superior innovation capacity of the West has to be brought to bear to keep ahead of China technologically and dominate those fields, which indeed China attempts to dominate. So I would advocate a transatlantic program on the scale of the Kennedy moonshot, the Roosevelt arsenal of democracy response to Nazi Germany, to the Reagan military buildup and strategic defense initiative to force development of technology and its applications, which would keep the West continuously ahead of China. It will be a cat and mouse game indefinitely, but we can only win by keeping ahead of China, not by trying to suppress them at this point. Thank you.
Well, thank you. you, David. And Pavel, let me just turn to Europe. And you have a vantage point there. There is a provocative assertion that China is a European power through Huawei and our own engineers, and a call for a transatlantic major effort. I turn to you, and I think that you, as I say, you have a fantastic perspective on this issue. But for our American audience, I would ask if you can also give an idea on how we Europeans manage this, I wouldn't even say schizophrenia, this idea that we have 27 approaches to China, the national approaches, plus the 17 plus 1, and the Leipzig that will not happen, plus the EEAS and the European institutions that just sometimes are not in line with what they have said. And then we have the Central Eastern European members of the European Union that have a particular, I would say, approach. How do you see all that?
Thank you very much, Anna, for giving me the floor. And thank you for this occasion to think together and to compare our experiences, because we need definitely to coordinate on the global level across democracies. I speak on behalf of parliaments, but also on the level of governments. Yes, we have China. We had China on the menu of a NATO London summit when, for the very first time in 2019, China came into the text of the final declaration as one of the growing challenges. But within the EU, we have 27 member states meeting China, and it's very important to highlight that this year in September, the summit, which was programmed, was simply postponed without any date due to coronavirus. So I think that this is important to note, that we have maybe more time to coordinate, because there is ongoing state capture that we can observe across European member states. Maybe it started after the last financial crisis in 2008, when some weaker economies were approached by investors from China, proposing them buying the state bonds. But there is also another format than EU 27, and this is the format 17 plus 1 you mentioned, Anna. And this format is just crazy one, because you have member states of EU or member states of NATO together with countries from the post-Soviet region, including the countries from Western Balkans. And there you have a very interesting format in which China proposes, China offers, and completely splits the joint European approach based on some values within the EU. And this is a format which is extremely dangerous, because it can create split inside of the EU joint approach. I think that we are at the crossroads somehow. On one side, we have a consumer-based approach driven by price, sometimes subsidized on behalf of Beijing. So it is very difficult to compete with. But this consumer-based approach has, fortunately for us, an alternative, which is the one based on citizenship. And I think that if we stick to the citizenship approach, based on institutions, on deliberation, then we can definitely have a say and maybe have an advantage, because we can challenge China, which doesn't want to step in this kind of approach based on open, transparent, and democratic deliberation.
Well, thank you. Allow me to insist that we have already some questions from our audience, but encourage those that are following this event to send us the questions to the app or whatever, the window that is just at the bottom of your screen. Pavel, of course, I don't want to interview because I'm moderating, but you have said something which is fundamental, well beyond China. What is our approach? Because we approach many areas as consumers, even our relationship with our governments, it's the consumer. We pay, you give us services. So the question is on the floor. How, and of course, Andrew, I would like you to just comment on, do you think it's feasible, or are we dreaming that there will be a coordinated transatlantic response? For the moment, frankly, I'm an optimist. My nature is optimistic, but right now I really don't see this happening. Of course, as Pavel has very well said, even us Europeans, we have very different perspectives and we try to muddle through. But frankly, how can we imagine, how can we project a common approach, a functioning, a forward-looking common approach? And this is a question to all of you, but maybe Andrew, of course, you can comment on any of the interventions as well.
Thank you, Anna. Terrific interventions, and I'd like to pick up on something that David said, and that will relate to what you're asking. I agree 100%. We need to outcompete the Chinese. Having said that, in order to be able to actually proceed in that fashion, there is a military security dimension to what we are doing. And I said this, the kind of Tennessee proverb, if you find yourself in a hole, stop digging. I'm showing my Cold War roots here. During the Cold War, we had NATO COCOM restrictions, for example, that would not allow the Russians to access, to purchase, to transfer technology. Part of the problem that we're facing today, especially if you look at the kind of contracting gap between the Chinese systems and our systems, the different areas in the multi-domain environment that's giving us more and more headache as we look at it going forward, is the fact that we have not only allowed the Chinese access to design and the knowledge base, but through offshore manufacturing, we have accomplished the most massive transfer of technology known to man. The Russians could steal, reverse engineer, copy Western military systems. They did some terrific math themselves. They did wonderful designs in many cases, but they had to grow their own computer wafers. Their clean rooms were terrible. Their alloys, processes, manufacturing techniques, all of that, which makes for a superior technology. We have in effect transferred in the process, accomplishing this massive technology transfer. And David also mentioned something very important, access to our universities. Of 1 million people that we would bring in every year, about 370,000 of them, I believe last year, were Chinese graduate students. So they have taken that knowledge base now and they've implanted it in their own country, and they're now innovating based on that. So the reason I say stop digging, yes, we will not prevail in this conflict, but cutting off access, but decoupling of our fundamental supply chains, especially those that directly relate to our national security, to our defense, even at the cost of some loss of efficiency, is, in my view, absolutely essential. And this brings me to Anna's question about reaching consensus. We currently have in the high NATO reflection group engaged. It's co-chaired by an American and a German. And in my view, there's a very broad agenda for what they're doing. But in my view, one of the most fundamental aspects of that work is reaching consensus on the nature of the Chinese threat. In other words, where the Americans are increasingly seeing the military dimension, because we see the Chinese People's Liberation Army Navy operating in the Med, acquiring port facilities, getting into the Baltic with the tenders for the 33,000-ton nuclear-powered icebreakers. The Chinese are going to be punching through the Arctic. They're building aircraft carrier battle groups, supply ships. All of that from our perspective, from the military dimension, is extremely, extremely troublesome. And what that means is that as we try to out-innovate and out-compete the Chinese, we need to reach a consensus that the threat is not just an economic, a commercial threat. There is a very clear military dimension to what's going on. And that I believe until the Europeans begin to perceive that in that fashion as well, we will be very hard-pressed to reach a consensus on what to do about China.
Well, David, allow me to ask Pavel, because Pavel is nodding as a European, and I'm nodding as a European. You are absolutely, I mean, I fully concur with you, Andrew, but of course, Pavel and I and many other Europeans, we know that this is not the, I mean, this is not a mainstream position in Europe at all. So Pavel, this idea that the military potential of China poses not even a threat, a question mark. Europe sees China on commercial terms, and not always this just carries a concern. Europe has been sitting on the fence, trying to take the best of both ways. As Butikoffer always says, you know, we see China as a systemic rival in the morning, and we see China as a cooperative power in the afternoon. Pavel.
Thank you. I agree, and I am very much happy to continue this reflection, because I think that this is a joint responsibility that we have to spread from the security community to the real public debate, because the public or the democratic choice has to be done. And as a member of the Czech Parliament, I can assure you that we had China as a challenge and as a threat almost every single month on our menu this year and this last 2 years. So I'm just a beginner among senators, but I did my utmost, and I succeeded with my fellows to have several very bold resolutions voted in a country where we can observe the state capture approach by Chinese business and leadership. So this is something that I can bring as experience, that it is possible, that we have to bring to the public space the very challenge Andrew spoke about, which is military, strategic, not only economic and not only commercial. I definitely agree. But there is something even more important that we have to mobilize for. Imagine that you have a strategic brain working as intern in your team. You will need 10 years at least that this strategic young person becomes competitive in Chinese language. So we have a difficulty in the depth of our analytical potential that will require major investments in terms of sharing in detail what we see, what we observe, and what we analyze in the Chinese realm, in the Chinese world, as potential threat to us. They have, for instance, for the Czech language, 10 million inhabitants, they have thousands of Chinese, maybe 10,000 of Chinese specialists working on us. On our side, we have a tiny little group. Part of them is engaged in business and commercial activities with them, so we can just forget them. And if you would like to couple the strategic brains with the deep know-how of Chinese culture, we have 10 years of investment to come. And this is time to mobilize. And I sign the declaration of Andrew. It is time to move.
Well, I think that this is a major issue. We normally not pay too much attention to this idea that understanding China and speaking Chinese is a big endeavor, and we are not devoting 1/10 or maybe 1/100th of the efforts that we should have. David, to just jump in, and I will go to the questions. We have some very good questions. David.
Yes. Very briefly, I agree with Andrew that the military dimension is central. The digital age was created by Defense Department subsidies to American corporate laboratories that invented every component of the modern economy. The only way we get fundamental innovation is by going to the frontiers of physics, which we need to do to deal with new weapon systems, defense against hypersonic glide missiles, which China now has, defense against silent diesel electric submarines, defense against China's massive surface-to-ship missile force, against its anti-satellite missiles, against its electronic warfare capabilities. These are critical. Quantum computing is critical. So I believe that the only way we will leapfrog China is by starting with the military priorities and making them the focus of technological intervention. And exactly as Andrew said, we created the China problem. The American technology sector after 2000 made a willful decision to build software and let Asia build all of the hardware. So whereas 30 years ago, we dominated semiconductor production, in the United States, we only have 12% of world semiconductor production, and mainly older stuff. We had to ask the Taiwanese to come and build a state-of-the-art plant, which is not quite state-of-the-art, but a modest improvement. So absolutely, the military dimension should be paramount. And what I would hope to do with respect to Europe is find better jobs for the 50,000 foreign employees of Huawei who are now doing their basic research and put them in harness to Western innovation as opposed to Chinese imperial designs.
Well, we have Ericsson. We have some companies that used to be very good in that. And I will start. I will start asking you this question. This is from our audience, and we see China as a powerful, upcoming hegemon. But there is this question: don't you think, and I'm quoting, don't you think that all internal unsolved problems, unemployment, ethnic rivalry, political reivindications, demography to come soon, can lead to a dislocation of China, like what happened to the USSR in maybe 20 years? Interesting.
I don't think China and the USSR are similar at all. The USSR had guns but not butter. China has increased personal consumption per capita 8-fold in one generation, which is, I think, unprecedented. It's an astonishing achievement. They have many internal problems, but I don't think that we should count on those problems taking them down for us. It would be convenient. On the demographics, yes, they have a long-term demographic problem. So does every country in the West. China's total fertility rate is now maybe 1.5 by most estimates. Europe is at 1.5, 1.6. We're at 1.7. So the demographic problem is a global thing. It may take China down, but not soon enough to help us.
Okay, I mean, there is another question linked to this one, also from our audience. It's what you have said. You say that China has nothing to do with the Soviet, but there is a question, how the threat is different, Andrew?
I think the
threat of China's.
Thank you, Anna. I agree with David on this. Comparing China, the PRC, People's Republic of China, yes, it is still a communist ideology-based kind of neo-Confucian state. But comparing China to the USSR misses the point entirely. The major difference is the speed with which the Chinese managed to modernize their economy. The extent to which they have gone to school on us, again, I'm coming back to the access to our society at every level, while at the same time the Chinese can insulate their own sphere, if you will. And Pavel made an absolutely brilliant point. The paucity of expertise on China in the United States and in Europe across the board is mind-boggling. We are now in a situation where we're trying to rebuild this. I will remind you that during the Cold War, area studies were a pathway to tenure at American universities. People studied Soviet East European politics, languages, history, traveled through the region. Let's say that 3 or maybe 5% of the PhDs working in that area would become tenured academics, but most of them would feed into government, they would feed into industry, think tank community, and so forth. That has all but disappeared. The kind of pathway that you see in political science and other areas, in my view, contributes only marginally, if at all, to the national security dimension that we're confronting. So Pavel is absolutely, in my view, 100% right, that until we begin to do this in a serious fashion, understanding the culture, understanding the history, understanding the society and what drives it, and not build models and assume some universalist, liberal-driven transformation. Until we stop projecting what we believe the world looks like on China, we will not understand it. The Soviet Union, because of the Russian history, had some element of westernization as it developed. It had a very thin but westernized elite, but it was a different elite than what you see in China. So I think waiting for somehow the forces of nature, as the Soviets used to say, the correlation of forces to shift in our favor, I think it's naive and it borders on irresponsibility. We need to get proactive. We need to agree on the nature of the threat. If you take the resources of the transatlantic community, you add it to this, the essential troika from Asia, the Japanese, the South Koreans, the Australians, other countries that we have alliances with, my money is on the West. But we need a fundamental change in our threat assessment and the mentality with which we approach China.
Well, I think that we have to ask the Atlantic Council to do a assessment. My money is also on the West. Nevertheless, I have a question which is interesting because it puts the light on us. And the question says, how likely is a transatlantic coordination between Europe and the US, especially in the light of rise of right-wing, inward-looking regimes in many of these countries? One example being Brexit and Trump withdrawal from Paris Climate Summit. Who wants to jump in? I mean, personally, and I will just give you I'm a moderator, but I will jump the fence. I think that we always look at the right and the identitarian nationalist right. I mean, I think that many times we are hijacked by this, the official, at least in Europe, the official leftist perspective. I mean, there is a right, but there is also a left. So with that, you know what I think. Anyway, your turn, gentlemen. Pavel, jump in.
Well, I think the Trump administration's approach to Europe has been in many ways disappointing. I think a great deal of tension has been created, which is not necessary. The Trump administration is entirely justified to point to Europe's failure to meet its obligations for military funding under NATO agreements. On the other hand, our attempts to force the Europeans to drop the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, some other things, have only created rancor. But I strongly believe that if the United States were to undertake a systematic effort to restore American preeminence in technology and leapfrog the Chinese, then Europe, simply as a matter of self-interest, would have to adapt to the American program. And I believe that the Europeans would prefer 1,000 times to deal with an obstreperous, difficult, and sometimes annoying United States than to deal with a hungry, assimilative, and ultimately dangerous China.
May I? I think that, Anna, your question goes in the global space that we can't forget the continent which is close to Europe and which is Africa. I think that European Union speaks about Africa as priority since many years, but we don't see the results. And what we see, what we observe on the ground are raising examples, many examples of raising predominance of interests linked to China. So I think that this is something that we have to pay attention, because in Africa, the demography is exploding. We see the hotspots of jihadism there, and environment, as you mentioned, is also concentrated there in terms of challenges for the future. So I think that without addressing a real strategic issue of African continent, which has direct impact to the global issues and to Europe mainly, we will not understand what is ongoing to be a next list of topics for Europe.
Yes, Anna, and if I may just very briefly jump in on these comments. Pavel is absolutely right. I mean, Europe's southern border is no longer on the Med, it's in the Sahel, it's in MENA. So Africa's problems are increasingly becoming Europe's problems. And because China is present in Africa in multiple ways, that interconnects these two issues. On the transatlantic relationship, you know, this is my second tour in Germany, and I've watched the sparks fly and the kind of mutual accusations. A lot of it is unfortunate, but some of it I think is manifestation of something that has been going on a bit longer than the Trump administration or the Merkel chancellorship or Macron. The larger problem that we have seen, in my view, is that since the end of the Cold War, we've witnessed what I call the regionalization of security optics in Europe. So if you travel to the Baltic states, if you go to Oslo, if you go to Warsaw, it's all about Russia predominantly as the most immediate military security threat. Then as you start traveling to the West, things begin to change, and the imperative of this Russian threat begins to change. You get to France, it's more in the south, it's in the Med, it's in Africa. If you get to Portugal, I don't know where you go with it. But my point is, we have had the fundamental issue of not being able to reach a really deeply felt, understood, elite consensus-driven approach to what constitutes the principal security challenges, not just for the United States, but also for the Europeans. And remember that the 2 decades of the so-called global war on terror or overseas contingency operations, whatever you want to call this, has also contributed to the friction. On the other hand, the accusation that somehow American transactionalism is to be blamed for this, with all due respect, at the core, all alliances are to an extent transactional. People enter into them not just for the sake of values, but also for the sake of their own interests. So I think if you could get beyond that rhetoric, that it is President Trump, or it is Chancellor Merkel, or this is President Macron, or it's the Brits with Brexit, I think we would move forward. And I think being able to talk in a way that reconnects our policy elites in particular and our business community so that we can understand better what we're up against, I think that's the fundamental step we need to take.
Well, you give me a fantastic cue to another of our questions. And this idea that we have to reconnect with reality, with citizens, with companies, with businesses, and that there is a jargon that goes there that doesn't respond. There is a question here. Everybody agrees on the challenge of regaining trust of the citizens and businesses. But given the digital environment and the intellectual compartmentalization we live in, can it still be done by politicians? Not bad. Who jumps on this? Pavel, you spoke about citizens and consumers. That's your cue.
Thank you. I think that there might be a double reply, and I will be short while developing it. First, when we speak China, oftentimes, in Prague at least, we hear that the economic interest should be respected and that big firms, big companies should have their say in shaping our China policy. But I think that the time has come to a certain moment that we have to admit that the risk of worsening Chinese situation for firms, for instance, not only politically, becomes so tricky that we have to raise the question of the risk, of a risk that every single company runs while to be exposed in China in a major terms. Take the example of Japan. Japanese government gave money on the table, inviting Japanese companies to leave Chinese market and Chinese economy. And this is something that we should follow in Europe and maybe more globally. And my second take is on a very local level of municipality of Prague. Imagine the capital of Czech Republic, Prague, 1 million and some several thousands, 100,000 inhabitants. They were inspired in the past to sign an agreement with a Chinese city on cooperation. And part of this cooperation agreement spoke about one China policy. And after elections in Prague, the newly elected council said, hey, one China policy is important, but not for our city council. We would like to develop cultural contacts and so far. But we do not want to make this big political engagements, declarations. And they started process of renegotiation of this cultural agreement. And the Chinese side refused to renegotiate. And the city council declared, we will do our best. And in the fall, we will pass to vote. And last year, during the summertime, no answer, no reaction came from Beijing. And city council had a vote in September to cancel this cooperation agreement. What is interesting, that on the eve of the vote, the Chinese ambassador to the Czech Republic didn't support the idea that this kind of open, transparent, democratic procedure could take place, and canceled the cooperation on his behalf. And this is something interesting. If you open the space for democratic deliberation, Chinese leadership doesn't support that you have a say in their strategic interests. So this is one small lesson learned in Prague City Council.
Well, you know, our audience is sending a lot of questions. I'm not sure that we will have time to respond to all of them. Allow me to go to David, but I have a question for you, Andrew, or just afterwards on the Chinese blue men in the Mediterranean. But David, one important issue on this idea of decoupling. I mean, what about American companies? I read a survey by the American Chamber of Commerce that American companies are not prepared or intending or anything to disinvest or withdraw from China. So what about this much heralded idea that we have to shorten the supply chains? This is one of your central issues.
American imports from China amount to about a quarter of our total industrial production. So the idea that we could replace this in any reasonable period of time is, of course, ridiculous. Robert Lighthizer, the special trade representative who counts as a China hawk, said precisely this in congressional testimony yesterday. The issue of decoupling, in my view, is a highly selective one. America, for example, needs to have its own semiconductor production. That's a national security priority. We know that it's possible to put bugs or trapdoors into chips which have 10 billion transistors in them that are impossible to find. So for national security reasons, we need to produce our own. We need our own medical equipment. We need our own pharmaceuticals. So selective decoupling is critical, and selective leapfrogging in areas which the Chinese do not yet dominate, in which we can remain preeminent, should be a priority. I'd like to say one thing in one sentence, Anna, about trust of populations. I think if politicians offer the people a vision of the future, which is going to be better than the present, which challenges their creativity and demands effort and intelligence, they'll get a very good response, precisely as John F. Kennedy did, precisely as Ronald Reagan did when they did those things in the past.
And if I may just add one comment to what David just said. One of the things that we have noticed in this COVID crisis is that we are so vulnerable, not just because we depend on the Chinese supply chain, but also because those supply networks have become truly radically centralized. I mean, we do not have the capacity to go to other regional supply chains with some redundancies built in for a number of items that we now import from China. So where I see a potential, for example, for transatlantic cooperation, for our cooperation with other countries in the Asia-Pacific area, is in those areas where we can indeed continue to leverage the greater efficiencies of manufacturing certain items away from our own home base. This is a great opportunity for us to redistribute, if you will. You're still capable of maximizing the efficiencies, but you do not have to do everything, especially that is so centralized when it comes to the supply chain in China. And quite frankly, when it comes to some critical elements that are absolutely vital to our national security, there has to be, I'm going to say the A word, there has to be a degree of autarky. We cannot rely on foreign supply chains for things that are absolutely critical to our weapon systems. And I know that I'm flying against the slipstream of the entire liberal free market ethos, but unfortunately, when it comes to national security priorities, that has to be taken into account, in my view.
Well, first, please, gentlemen, jump in. This is what makes this a dialogue. I'm administering the questions from the audience, but Pavel, I think that you have to jump in now, because this debate on what constitutes strategic sectors in Europe is, it's a big debate. There are companies, there are countries like, I don't know, Portugal. You mentioned Portugal. The electric system, for instance, is this a strategic sector? Yes or no? Pavel?
During the pandemic crisis, we saw very interesting situation in the Czech Republic, that our government decided to purchase all the equipment and protective equipment from China. And it is very interesting that we made several major mistakes. Different countries offered us to provide the equipment, and the leaders in the government refused. So we became even more dependent on the Chinese than before the crisis. And second, in our country, we have a tremendous potential of industrial base and of innovation. For instance, biotechnology or nanotechnology is something that we are really good in. Nevertheless, the government said to many actors of our supply chain that they prefer to deal with the big ones. So they missed completely the window of opportunity to challenge our industrial base and innovation base to create the potential for the future crisis. And this is a major mistake if you take into account not only this kind of strategic thinking, but if you start to count the billions which were just thrown from the window, it is a major problem. We do not need stocks, plenty of equipment, but we need robust potential for production. And this is something that our government, at least in Prague, completely missed as opportunity. So in terms of strategic posture, we didn't seize this opportunity to take the lesson. We do our best in the parliament, but we cannot replace ministers, unfortunately.
Well, allow me to ask you this question from the audience, but I have 3 questions from the audience that I'm going to regroup. So first, this idea of the Chinese blue men in the Mediterranean running fishing vessels and tourist groups are also a concern. Is this in the radar of authorities, both in Europe? This goes for you, Andrew. You said that our frontier was now in the Sahel, but the Mediterranean is there.
It is on the radar screen, Anna, but I would argue that it is unappreciated. It is not sufficiently considered as a serious security threat. The Chinese Navy has been going to school on the Western navies for the past 2 decades, and especially in the last decade. That process has accelerated. If you look at the Chinese port acquisition pattern, both in Asia, and if you look at increasingly also closer to home in Europe, if you look at the operations that they're planning in the Arctic, David mentioned the Belt and Road Initiative, basically building a secure transcontinental supply chain that China will then protect and defend, that's cutting through. If you look at its arrival into Europe, it's going, if it's successful, if this project is successful, and we also have 17+1, we have a great amount of influence from China coming into Europe, especially for smaller states that are starved for cash. This crisis will make matters even more difficult. But up to to about 2 decades ago, the thinking in geostrategic terms about the transatlantic relationship has been that the European rimland, if you will, was the gateway to Eurasia for the United States, for the transatlantic community. That relationship between maritime and land power domain will be reversed if the Chinese get their way. And that means that Europe, instead of being this grand gateway, will become a terminal point for the Chinese supply chain across Eurasia. Some of the projects that I see, especially infrastructure projects, suggest to me that they're moving in that direction. So I take Chinese naval operations very seriously. If you look at the number of ships that are being produced for the Chinese Navy today, are they up to our standards? Well, we can discuss this, till we're blue in the face. But the volume of what the Chinese are putting in terms of their naval power should give European allies and NATO alliance pause.
Anna,
Yeah, David, please.
very briefly, you mentioned the great Swedish telecommunications company, Ericsson. That's increasingly becoming a Chinese company. Its largest market is in China now, after it got 10% of the Chinese rollout of their 5G mobile broadband network. Its largest plant in the world is in Nanjing. It's a highly automated plant. They built just to placate the American authorities. They built a plant employing 100 people in Texas, which is basically a Potemkin village. China's approach to everyone, including Ericsson, is we will assimilate you. Become part of the Chinese empire. You'll get rich. When we rule the world, your death will be quick and painless. Don't worry about us. China's attraction power as the world's probably the world's largest economy in PPP terms, if not in US dollar terms, to European businesses is enormous. And unless there is a counter attraction power, which has to come from a centralized program for research and development and innovation, China's gravitational power economically will continue to assimilate larger and larger amount to the European economy.
Well, thank you. Pavel, do you want to add something to this? Because I want to go to the transatlantic, the foundations of the transatlantic relation. I think there are three questions here that I want to just bring together. And it means, the question exactly, one of them is, don't we have to get away of the old thinking and be smartly focused on new tech in defense and security rather than the legacy systems? It's not, haven't we reached a moment where we have to review the basis of our transatlantic community? And this, of course, brings me to a question that comes once and again, and it's you, Andrew, you said, President Trump is a fixation for Europeans, or for many Europeans, not all of them, but for many Europeans. And everybody thinks that if there is a change in the color of the next administration, the transatlantic relationship will go back to the old good days, that nobody defines these old good days, but there is a certain myth that is being created. You have said that the foreign policy of the present administration just has roots in previous administration. This is something that I share. But what would the three of you say about this transatlantic relationship? How can we just bet on something that I think that we share around this virtual table, is that, want it or not, but for us, the United States is the indispensable nation. The world has changed. Many things have changed. I don't think that we can aim at going back to the old days, good or bad. This is a new world. But what is constant is that the United States is the indispensable nation. Well, floor to you. Pavel, go ahead.
Thank you, Anna. I will start maybe by highlighting two issues which are linked to the very fundamentals of our freedom-based institutions and societies. Imagine that the very fundamentals are today challenged by Chinese leadership. In universities, you have many examples of behavior which is limiting the space for freedom of university teaching, freedom of speech. But we can also go further on. Many people come to the free world hoping that they could be protected from Chinese and other totalitarian regimes. But with the new technologies grip on our public space, their freedom becomes very limited. Even the space is shrinking, and the protection of the diaspora, which came to our own societies struggling for freedom and protection, is simply very small. And I think that this kind of fragility expose even more the inability of our societies to imagine that we can be target and that we can be seen as the enemies, both of Chinese and Russian current leadership.
Well, allow me, because unfortunately the clock is ticking. So allow me to throw two questions that are related. One question from the audience: will the COVID crisis cover up lead to reconsideration of Belt and Road? We haven't spoken of Belt and Road. We haven't spoken about, we have centered our dialogue, and this was the aim of it, on transatlantic relations. But what about India, China, the vicinity? Sir, I mean, I will give the last 5 minutes to Jean-Guillaume and Laure. So we have 10 comfortable minutes to go. Andrew, David, Who jumps
Yes, if I may just make one comment on your earlier question about transatlantic relations and the kind of, I think Susan Glasser called it the Trump derangement syndrome in Europe, that this anger at what manifests itself in the American body politic seems to overshadow everything. Look, I speak to European audiences quite frequently, and I bring the transatlantic relationship into focus in two ways. One, of course, as Pavel so eloquently said, this is about essential values of free societies, but it's also most fundamentally about national security interests. In a situation where we face potentially a firestorm in the Indo-Pacific, with the size of our Navy, the size of our Air Force, all other assets being what they are today, and the way we're structured in terms of our military campaigns, the likelihood that we would be able to continue to provide the requisite element of deterrence to the same extent as we did during the Cold War in Europe against the Russian threat simply doesn't add up. So when I say to the Europeans, transatlantic relations and your defense expenditure is critical because you need to have exercised military capabilities. It's not about 1%, 2%, 3%, 15% on defense. It's about real exercise capabilities that can credibly deter any Russian adventurism in the event there's crisis in the Asia Pacific. This is what binds us together, not just the values. But here, one last comment, and I will turn it over to David. Why we are in this situation. We're looking at a very serious crisis when it comes to our elites in terms of articulating the vision and pulling people in the direction of implementing that vision. I think a lot of the churning and turmoil you see on the European continent and in the United States is that the status quo is no longer acceptable. And yet the new vision, other than liberal international order, where we all drive Chevys or Toyotas, grow fat and live in this final end of history kind of paradigm, that is no longer sustainable. And this is not what the public is asking for.
Well, I think that this would be a fantastic topic for another session. David.
Regarding the question of Belt and Road and Chinese influence, for any number of reasons, the East Asian countries controlled the pandemic much more effectively than Western countries, and certainly better than India. One of the results is that a tendency long in process for Asia to become its own economic zone has been accelerated. 60% of Asian trade is now within Asia. That's about the same proportion as the European community. South Korea, for example, exports about twice as much to China as it does to the United States. So it's very difficult for any of the East Asian countries, Japan, China, South Korea, Taiwan, and so forth, to do without China because they become so tightly integrated. The only way to pry that apart is to radically change the technological balance so that everyone orients towards new American technologies. Unfortunately, back during the Kennedy moonshot, we spent 2% of GDP on federal R&D. Under Reagan, it was about 1.4%. Now it's 0.6%. So we're about $200 billion short. That's the magnitude of the problem. I completely agree with Andrew that we can reverse it, but we can't simply fall down to reverse it. We have to spend a great deal of money and a great deal of intelligence and effort to get back on top of this.
Well, my last question to all of you, and there are many, that just I think that the best result of a panel is when you leave the panel on your hunger that you could have gone for a longer time. There is a term that hasn't been even uttered: multilateralism. Today, when we speak about China, multilateralism comes to the fore. In this idea, how do we collaborate with China? So your last word on the perspective that you want on how we have to collaborate with China on the different global aspects, how to go about this. Pavel.
I am aware that the multilateralism is key for international dialogue on major issues of our time. Nevertheless, we have to admit that China succeeded to take over of many organizations that are critical for the world that we prepare. For instance, in terms of telecommunication within the UN, their leadership is simple already there. And I think that this is the reason why it is so important to study what happened during the pandemic and reading simultaneously the text of international health regulation, which is very clear. If you read the text, you see exactly what the leadership of any country having a trouble with a disease has to do. And I think that it is important because international health regulation is part of international law, and China didn't follow it. So it is another reason that we should be extremely severe with Chinese obligations to follow the written engagements, because if they declare, for instance, that with Huawei 5G technologies, they will declare their attachment to the fundamental freedoms and respect of privacy, we have to be extremely cautious. So yes, on the multilateral level, we see enough of examples how China treats the international obligations, and we have to be extremely cautious by engaging more with Chinese leadership.
Well, thank you. Andrew or David?
Look, multilateralism works when people agree on the rules of the game. If we maintain the fiction that we're engaged in some sort of a free trade environment with liberal market rules and what have you, and the other side decides to play a neo-mercantile kind of game, then multilateralism is not going to work. Not only because of what Pavel was talking about, that is the ability of the Chinese to influence or even capture some aspects of those multilateral organizations, but also simply because the rules are not universally recognized. And for us to be effective at enforcing those rules, we need to reach some baseline consensus among the Western community as to how we will engage with China so that we're not played off against each other. And finally, just look at the facts. I believe it was over a year ago, Congressional Research Service put out a study, I think, suggesting that 1 in 5 Western companies doing business in China was extorted for intellectual property in exchange for market access or other benefits. This should not be tolerated. But for this not to be tolerated, we have to reach a consensus across the Atlantic on how we want to move forward.
David?
China only understands power. It has no allies. It has no friends. It considers itself to be the center of civilization, and multilateralism is an entirely alien concept to Chinese thinking. To the extent they engage in it, it's to advance a entirely selfish agenda. That said, there are some issues like management of currency, exchange rates, which the International Monetary Fund can have something to say about, and other multilateral institutions where we should talk to the Chinese, but I don't think we should have any illusions that will get us very far.
Well, it has been a great pleasure. I know that Laure and Jean-Guillaume would like to ask some questions, so I give the floor to them. Laure?
Yes. Can you hear me? Yes. Yes, I just wanted you to come back to the question of the economic dependency and the economic drive, which led us to the situation where we are now. Because, if we look back to '89, it was this idea of economic, interest, which led us to the situation of China becoming this super giant and us becoming very dependent. And it seems that now we're at a point when many countries, because they see an advantage of having this special relationship with China that Pavel eloquently described, are ready for political submission. And the question is, how do we get out of this situation? And again, I think that you mentioned already, and I thought it was very interesting what Pavel, I think, said about business. You know, that Japanese government had tried to encourage, you know, the Japanese business to sort of withdraw from China when they thought that it was, in terms of national security interest, not recommended. So the question is, what do we do, you know, to convince? Because business has been driving this process. So how do the governments and you know, the civil society sort of takes over somehow, or at least get a seat at the table of this relationship with China?
Well, Laura, I would trust you to ask the most difficult question, which is the hardest to answer. But the problem, the idea that this is a free trade relationship is simply false, because the Chinese government, like in fact most Asian governments, massively subsidizes capital-intensive industry, the way we in the United States subsidize sports stadiums or airports. So we've had a tilted pool table that we're playing on, in which manufacturing capacity is shifted to Asia, mainly to China, while we've concentrated on software. From the standpoint of Microsoft and Google and Facebook, that's a wonderful arrangement. People can buy cheap computers or tablets or smartphones from China and pay them for the use of software products. There are ways that can transform this. For example, the future of manufacturing with artificial intelligence is highly flexible. The idea that fixed supply chains based on a set of skills which are located in a certain place that are difficult to move may not be applicable in only a few years. With flexible manufacturing, you can use artificial intelligence to have industrial robots very quickly reconfigure themselves to produce a very wide variety of things, which would make it much easier to reshore production back to the United States or indeed to Europe. So going after the technological frontier, which will require subsidies from governments, tax subsidies and some direct subsidies, could change the playing field entirely, because the old industrial regime under which China and other Asian countries dominated manufacturing may not apply at all under conditions of the fourth industrial revolution powered by artificial intelligence. So I think the answer to your question is innovation, innovation, and more innovation, and the West is saved, if I can paraphrase Danton.
Andrew, anything to add?
I would add to this two things, and we haven't talked at all about the financial side of things, the Chinese Sovereign Wealth Fund and the financial transactions that are a very important part now of how China can influence the West and do business in the West and with the West, or at the West's expense, if you will. I think one of the problems is the kind of ideological chutzpah or myopia post-1990 that gave rise to the whole ideology of globalism, globalization, transnationalism, the argument that institutions always trump culture, that if we design certain processes and institutions, then it doesn't really matter who manufactures what, where it is being distributed, because the world is moving in the same direction. A lot of it has to do, and this is a very long conversation for maybe another occasion, but what has happened to our economic and political elites in terms of how we educate people, how we prepare them for leadership positions, how they look at institutions. And the final aspect of the problem here is, look, we have deindustrialized large sectors of the US economy. David is right. We can rely on software and robots and artificial intelligence. But we also have a problem of finding a sufficient amount of people within our own university system who have engineering skills, who have technological skills. You know, I spent 25 years in academia, and I have to tell you that most of the students that I interacted with who were in the STEM track were mostly foreigners, most of them from Asia. We had a very small segment of the population that was native-born American that was actually going in those directions, while the curricula shifted to, grievance studies and things of that sort that kind of dominated our structure. So this is a multi-layered problem. But the last comment I will make here, Laura, is that there has to be a sense of the return to the P word, and I'm going to use it judiciously, patriotism. That there is some responsibility on the part of business leaders, on the part of political class, for the welfare of the people that they are entrusted with. I work with the military, and in the military culture, you see that you earn the right to lead by taking care of your men. This is the fundamental starting point. Where are we now in terms of our skill set in the United States? If you stop manufacturing, and if you transfer, if you make a highly skilled worker into a burger flipper in the next generation, where's that whole technological culture going to go? It's going to evaporate and disappear. So we need to approach this, I think, from the elite level. We need to have a sense of civic responsibility for national security and for how we look at the future generations' position in this global economy. Otherwise, the sinomorphing that David talks about will dominate.
Yeah.
Well, I think you join what Pavel said at the beginning, that China has to be responded from the citizenship, not from the consumer perspective. Pavel, a last word, because we have 3 minutes to go, and I know that Jean-Guillaume would like to say a concluding remarks. So,
thank you. I will just continue what Andrew started to develop with David. I think that we didn't speak about leadership, and this is something that we have to broaden in the technological realm we are part of today. Let me be very explicit. Chinese leadership, and I am not the expert, according to my observation, is today very nervous, somehow because it didn't manage properly the corona crisis. And even though they invested major energy in selling their face mask diplomacy and help and assistance worldwide, people are simply angry because of the outbreak of the virus. So there will be probably some tension that we will observe within China and around China that might be part of this nervous state of mind. Nevertheless, we have to admit that in European open democracies, and this is the same for United States, we are in a very fragile situation because we have this Twitter and Facebook and TikTok platforms, which are not only sharing visions for the future, but also emotions and fears, and which are annihilating many of the freedoms we were attached to. Freedom for intimacy, freedom for private life, freedom of political free expression, and so on. And I think that if we see what happens in our cities with this outbreak of demonstrations, we have to be extremely cautious because similarly, China will have a difficult period of time for its leadership, but in our open democracies, attacked by this huge artificially driven machines, we will have a challenge of emotions and of expectation that will be simply extremely fragile to manage.
well, what can I say, gentlemen? It has been a great honor. As we have seen, there are topics that we haven't had time to address because the issue is broad, and we could do 3 seminars or 10 seminars, and there would be topics that we wouldn't have addressed. As I say, I have enjoyed. I hope that our audience has enjoyed at least 1/10 of what I have enjoyed. And I give the floor to Jean-Guillaume because our time is over. Thank you, and see you soon in another panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. What can I say after such an introduction? Time is indeed over, so I will be very short. I would like to thank you enormously for this fabulous debate. And as you said, a good debate is when you leave it with hunger. It's like a good meal. There were a number of topics we could have addressed, like, for example, the place of the Chinese in international organizations like IP Health. That's a big issue. Hong Kong is also a big issue we haven't addressed. And I had a message not that far ago from a Hong Kong entrepreneur saying, you know, don't think that COVID has undermined our determination, and we hope that the West will step in at some point at the end of the crisis. So many other topics. So we are still hungry, which is good. And we are going to close now. That was a fabulous debate. Thank you so much to our panelists and to our moderators, and to all of you who have stayed with us on Friday night. So thank you very much. It was great being together in this difficult context, and you know, we are looking forward to seeing all of you in Tocqueville next year, and make sure that you enjoy Normandy at that time.
Thank you, Jean-Guillaume.
So,
Thank you.
goodbye to all. Thank you, and see you very soon again.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Yeah.
Bye.